Welcome, everyone. I'm Karin Christensen with the Newberry Library. Thank you for joining us for today's program, Slinging Inc. Part 1, Wood Type and Letterpress in the Midwest, with Bill Moran and Jim Moran of the Hamilton Wood Type and Printing Museum, and the Newberry's Jill Gage. We're grateful to the Paul M. Angel Family Foundation for sponsoring this program. The Newberry Library supports and inspires research, teaching, and learning in the humanities. Since our founding in 1887, the Newberry has remained dedicated to deepening our collective understanding of ourselves and the world around us. We connect researchers and visitors with our collection in the Newberry's reading rooms, exhibition galleries, program spaces, classrooms, and online digital resources. The Newberry has recently reopened our doors to readers and visitors. You can visit our website, newberry.org, to make an appointment to do research in the reading rooms. Or you can stop by the library without an appointment, Tuesday through Friday afternoons, to visit our exhibition halls and the Rosenberg Bookshop. Following Illinois state guidelines for COVID-19 restrictions and for the safety of our community, our public programs remain virtual. Please visit newberry.org to learn more about our many digital resources, online classes, and virtual public programs like this one. You can always shop our bookshop's selection of wonderful books and unique gifts online as well. And I encourage you to follow the Newberry on social media for more opportunities to engage with our collections, our staff, and stories that bridge the past and the present. Today's program is one example of the Newberry Library's civic commitment to public education and intellectual engagement, bringing together communities of scholars, students, and the public to discuss ideas that matter to our world today is central to the Newberry's mission. During the program, please enter questions in the Q&A feature on Zoom or in the comments section if you are joining us on Facebook or on YouTube. As time permits, our speakers will respond to your questions. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Jill Gage. Jill is the Newberry's custodian of the John M. Wing Foundation on the History of Printing and bibliographer for British literature and history. Please join us, Jill.
Thanks, Karin, and thanks everyone for being here today for the first in our two-series program with the brothers Moran from Hamilton Wood Type. I am so delighted to introduce our speakers today. They have been so integral to helping me think about the history of wood type and the history of letterpress, but also wood type and letterpress in the Midwest in the present day. And if you haven't been to the Hamilton Wood Type Museum, I highly suggest you go when you can go again, when it is safe. It's a wonderful place, and I believe that Two Rivers is also the birthplace of the ice cream sundae. So you can print and have some ice cream. So we have a lot of ground to cover, so I will quickly introduce Bill and Jim. Jim Moran is the director of the Hamilton Wood Type Museum. After working in his family's print shop for many years in Green Bay, I believe, Green Bay, Wisconsin. He came to Hamilton after working as a printer for many years. He has studied and contributed to the art and craft of print for more than 35 years, which seems impossible because he's so young. He currently leads letterpress workshops, archives the collection, and maintains the museum. Bill Moran is a third-generation letterpress printer and graphic designer. He teaches printing history at the University of Minnesota. He is the author of Hamilton Wood Type, A History in Headlines. And he is the former artistic director of the Hamilton Wood Type Museum. And so this presentation really came about, this series of presentations, when we were thinking about the Midwest and printing in the Midwest. And I thought there was absolutely no one better to talk to us about that. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Jim and Bill.
Thank you, Jill. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Two Rivers, Wisconsin. We are roughly 3 hours straight up the lakeshore from you, at least if you're in Chicago. But it's nice to be able to talk to you and about both Hamilton and type in the Midwest. So Bill and I will get rolling and begin to give you some ideas about not only what we do here, but certainly historically how this developed in many ways in a rather strange place. So I think we can move on to the slideshow portion, and I will kind of begin narrating. One of the things that we often tell visitors when they get here is that Hamilton, based on the business of James Edward Hamilton in 1880, began in Two Rivers as a type maker, quite inadvertently. Slide, please, Elizabeth. Hello. What we'll do, you could change the slide, and we'll take a look at what is the Hamilton origins, if you will. James Hamilton, if nothing else, was good with wood, and I say that because of his prior work in a pail and chair factory in Two Rivers, where he honed his skills with wood and really began making type simply because he was asked to do so. What I'm referring to is the fact that a local newspaper editor comes to Hamilton and says, "You are good with wood and I need some type. I can't get any wood type in a short order because all of the American type makers in 1880 were on the East Coast, and he could get it from Hamilton more quickly." So what he ended up doing is, in essence, creating a new way of making wood type, which is a veneer style of type as opposed to the traditional methods which we will talk about later. The building here from 1884 says Hamilton and Katz, which was an early partner of Hamilton's. Actually, I believe the second partner that Hamilton had, those were in essence silent or financial partners. So we can change slide and we will begin to show you what was happening as Hamilton moves through that first decade, which is growth, massive growth, making wood type for initially the Midwest, but then moving out through the country. So the first statistic I want to give you is that when Hamilton opens his doors in 1880, truly he is in the middle of nowhere, but he is close to an exploding population in the U.S. Midwest. As an example of that, in 1880, Chicago has 503,000 residents. By the time of this photograph, they have over 1 million residents. And when you begin to think of print shops and particularly newspapers, if they all need headline type, which is in essence what Hamilton is making for them, that is an incredible amount of business. And Hamilton, as he reaches out into those areas, is also able to draw on all of those other cities in the Midwest, which are also expanding at an incredible rate. So Milwaukee, for example, is at 115,000 in 1880, but again, by this time they have 204,000 people. Detroit is showing similar numbers as are Minneapolis and St. Paul. So this ready market in the Midwest gives Hamilton an incredible leg up on the industry. So the proximity becomes his first huge advantage. He is able to get to the printers of the Midwest in half the time of anybody else, or certainly all competitors, but then he has that secondary advantage of selling his type at half the cost. So we can change slides here, and
before you do,
excuse me.
Can I just let's go back to that illustration for a second, Elizabeth. Thank you. So in 1891, I think one of the important things about this engraving is you see that they've got a building on the center left dedicated to wood type, but on the right you've got a building B dedicated to printers material. And so he's making equipment that printers will use and put the type in. And so printers furniture is a huge part of the expansion because wood type is small stuff, but these printers are needing places to put their equipment. In general, shops weren't very standardized in terms of the way they were laid out. And so he brings a tremendous amount of organization to print shops as well. And so he's cross-selling these other products that he's then calling on printers to sell.
That's right. Yeah, thank you. It is such a great point. You can change the slide because now we get to sort of meet the man himself. James Hamilton there in the dark suit and tie standing in front of the pantograph, which is a type cutting tool that we will come back to. But, it is an excellent point that Hamilton is very innovative in the fact that, simply speaking, if you sell someone enough type, they're going to have to put it somewhere. And so that does begin this idea of making type cases, type cabinets, composing tables, what printers refer to in terms of spacing material, furniture, etc. So he becomes a cabinet maker at the same time. So Hamilton is growing at a phenomenal rate. And this idea of very high quality veneer type, as well as the furniture, in essence, has him being the one-stop shop for printer's equipment, particularly if it was made out of wood. The veneer method that Hamilton comes up with is quite unique. All of his competitors are using a router and cutting their type on a pantograph. So in the foreground of this photograph, you see the corner of one of the type cutting tables, as they were called, that Hamilton acquired from his competitors. At this point, Hamilton has put so much pressure on those individual makers that he has bought them out, or he is nearly driving them out of business simply by the volume that Hamilton has absorbed. Slide, please.
I love the fact that we still have these pantographs on the museum floor. So when you visit the museum, that beautiful spiral shape you see there on that table, you can find that very table on the museum floor here.
And we're using it.
And we're using it.
All right, onward. What you are looking at here is what we refer to as veneer type, and also a very unique stamp. Printers would type cutters would mark their type in this way, where you would hammer in a die that gives you the name of that particular maker. And so Hamilton and Baker is the earliest known stamp that we have. It, I believe, even precedes the Hamilton cat's name in terms of being some of the very first type. And Hamilton was using what we now consider a rather unusual wood for the veneer, the wood from the holly tree. And so when they open up their doors, they're calling it the Hollywood type company, not maybe being the sharpest tool in the shed. When I began at Hamilton and I saw Hollywood type, I thought, oh, and no, that is nothing to do with California. But the Hollywood type is what Hamilton used for those first, I would say, 12 years until he absorbed so many makers that he could convert to their method of routing the type.
Did they stamp every piece of type in a collection?
Good point, Bill. They did not. And it was always the letter A. But it is also curious that we find that it is not consistent from the standpoint that if you bought a collection of maybe 25 drawers of different type, you'd find some are stamped, some are not. It does not seem to be focused on those that are most ornate. It is almost as though sometimes they remembered to stamp it and sometimes they didn't. But the point is, it is our best way of finding out who the maker is. There are other methods because, oddly enough, saws are centric to areas, and you can often look at the bottom of a piece of type and see that the saw marks would perhaps indicate Hamilton or another maker. Slide, please. This is a timeline to give you that sense of what happened prior to Hamilton and then once he really got his foot in the door, and then the rest of himself. We often talk about Darius Wells as the father of American type, and you can see his timeline dating back to 1830. Wells was a phenomenal type maker and began by making hand-cut type, which we will see later. He was also, for about a 10-year stretch, paralleling with Edwin Allen, who was also a wonderful type maker, who sold to Cooley, who sold to Page, who sold to American, etc. But what you are seeing also is the absorption of so many type cutters into the Hamilton fold. Now, Empire wood type and American wood type do continue onward, but they never reached that peak that Hamilton did. Hamilton, in essence, by 1895 had wrapped up basically the entire U.S. market. And what that really means in terms of headlines is that if you are talking about the Spanish-American War or the Vietnam War, those headlines from the New York Times to the Chicago Tribune to the LA Times are more often than not printed with Hamilton type. Onward. So now we are looking at the type of Darius Wells that is in the Hamilton collection. Beautifully ornamented type and quite finely carved. When you consider the consistency needed to have multiple characters cut by hand that will look uniform when printed, this is really amazing stuff. The photograph on the right is the Wells stamp from those early days. This is roughly speaking 1850 type and was acquired by the museum at its inception in 1999, I would say. That was when the Hamilton Museum began. This type is maybe not unbreakable, but it has survived 2 fires before it got to Hamilton, so the fact that it's around at all is really welcome to us and one of the finest things that we have in the collection, because as American type goes, some of the absolute oldest that was cut.
And I think the nice thing about this photograph on the left is that when you look at those 2 M's, rather than having a template for it, somebody has to go in and carve those by hand. And so from an artistic standpoint, it's really quite remarkable because it's really an engraving process at this point. And
Exactly.
the detail that they managed to achieve very directly reflects the style of the times. There is definitely an aesthetic that type makers are responding to in terms of Victorian clothing, Victorian architecture, etc. There's very much a response to it stylistically.
Slide, please. One of the primary type cutters that Hamilton absorbed was his predecessor, William Page, of both Norwich, Connecticut and Greenville, Connecticut, as you see on the stamp here. Page was brilliant in terms of type design. This particular style, which is not only most elegant, but a chromatic, meaning a 2-color style, was cut by him, we guess, in the 1880s, which would be about 10 years before his acquisition by Hamilton. When you see the right photograph, you are looking at the 2 M's, the the one to be printed first as background and the secondary one to be overprinted, and creating a really elegant, if not the most usable display font. But it does say a lot about Hamilton that they were able to incorporate all of Page's designs within their collection. As Hamilton absorbed type cutters, he gathered more and more type styles into the fold, eventually ending up with roughly 500 fonts. However, some of the most elegant styles that he has were designed by the people working for William Page. And so you are suddenly able to offer all of this brilliant type. Now, backing up with Hamilton, they initially did not need to design fonts. They were using things that we would say were in the public realm, and certainly Gothic styles were very common. You could, let's say, steal them if you chose to. And then there were perhaps the more useful styles that everyone was making, Clarendons being one of those styles of type that were commonly used. Sometimes Clarendon is referred to as French Clarendon, but in its origins, I think that it's Italian in nature. So you can see the borrowing has already gone on. But what we're going to begin illustrating are some of those styles that heavily influenced Hamilton's work, as well as the way they were displayed for sale. So we can change the slide now and begin looking at some of those things. The sheet that we are looking at is within the Newberry's collection. They have a William Page chromatic specimen book, which is absolutely brilliant, and in many ways, while it is an advertisement for Wade's inks, it is also, I would say, William Page at his zenith. This American chromatic typeface is illustrated on the sheet how you too can print this in two colors, and then you see the actual physical type, which is in Hamilton's collection. The other thing that should be noted as we scroll through the various pictures from the book that the Newberry has is the brilliant borders that were being made by Page as well. And so as opposed to the type, which has to be cut on a pantograph, while it can occasionally be stamped or routed, it is more often stamped to produce it. More on that to come, and we can move along with the slides. I think what we're going to be going through in the next few slides could maybe be summed up in terms of, I don't know, I guess the pornography of typography. You have elegant styles. The Aldine ornamented is on the one side. I'm struggling here with my right and left. You'll forgive me because I've got my screen, knowing that you may see it in reverse. But anyway, there is the script style, which is a Page font. I refer to it as Studebaker because that auto company used that font exclusively for its advertising. But two very nice styles of type. What is also interesting too is that while type in general is always cut as a single letter, unless we're talking about those combinations, the ligatures of FFI, FFL, you see it here in other applications where you're seeing TH and TO and TA as combinations. But this happens to be a very finely and deeply cut font, which is just a beautiful style.
It's also on an italic body, which is really unusual. So to extend what Jim said, type is generally cut on a 90-degree angle. But in order to get this script aesthetic to work properly, they're not only doing the ligatures, as Jim points out, but they're also, the type is being cut on an italic body so it can mimic that script typeface. I love the fact that they have two S's there as well. You've got a script S and a more standard S there at the bottom of our photograph.
Right, variations in characters. Let's move on. I feel like I'm talking too much. This is a copy of Hamilton's 1905 specimen book. All type cutters put out a specimen book annually. This one in particular was guarded rather strongly by Hamilton, who I believe in the copy there indicates that you'd better return this when you're done. What is extremely significant about this particular book is that it was the last time that Hamilton was going to show you various makers, because even though a given typeface should be cut in a standardized way, there were variations done by one type cutter to another type cutter to another. And so what we are seeing is Morgan's and Wilcox's version of a given font, as opposed to Hamilton's version or Page's version or Tubbs' version. And so it was basically Hamilton saying, in a sense, I know that you have been Heberwell's customer for many years, and you happen to get that style of font from him. We make it this way, but this is your last year to order it like that. Maybe as a side note, 1905 is the last year that you could order type via telegraph. But anyway, the point here is interesting, and it also makes the type sorter's job miserable, because you see a font that seems to match incredibly well, and the reason it's not a perfect match is because you're seeing those variations that each individual type cutter would make to it. Serifs that are pointed versus squared off, or extensions that are shown in one case and not another.
The other thing that I'd like about this quote that comes from that 1905 specimen book is you've got Hamilton working to protect his intellectual property. So he makes it clear in the publishing of this book that not only is it not a specimen catalog that's to go out into the public, it's only for his salespeople's hands, but also as he says here, they want to protect their interests. And so what they're doing is, as the industry is consolidating, and that's really one of the great things that Hamilton does, is he is a consolidator of multiple designs, multiple companies, conglomerate. He's gathering all these designs under one roof. And he puts this quote on page 5 of this catalog saying, don't give this thing away. This is not for public distribution, because he's recognizing that there is intellectual property that he wants to protect.
Slide, please. One thing that is worth mentioning as well is that the Newberry does have specimen books within their collection. I believe in addition to the Page chromatic specimen book, they also have the Hamilton 1910 book, but that is probably just the tip of the iceberg if I know the Newberry. Here again, we begin to see these variation in fonts. As you look at the shoulders and the legs and the feet of these types, you're beginning to see that variation in making it a bit more stylistic or making it less stylistic. Now, one sad thing to point out is that while Hamilton does incorporate all of the Page fonts into their collection, at least from a property standpoint, they aren't going to make them all because they may be considered a little bit too garish or too fancy for the modern eye. They absorb them and then they burn all of Page's patterns, which is unfortunate. Hamilton has a massive collection of their own patterns, but in terms of preserving history, maybe not so much. Slide, please. We're moving into a slightly different realm here, but one that we've touched on before, and that has to do with the making of borders, which are far too delicate for a pantograph. When you look at the two ornaments together, both used and an unused, you can see how delicate those lines are, and they cannot be cut by the narrow router bit on a pantograph. And so basically the die stamper plunges into the wood and compresses it to make these elegant borders. We can move on and work our way toward the die stamping machine itself, but here is an example of something that first appears in the 1904 Hamilton specimen book for the first time, which they refer to as Japanese corners, I believe. No idea why they are referred to that way, but what we are looking at in detail is not just a border made with a massive die, but many small dies repeatedly, meaning you have to run it through the die stamper possibly 7 different times to get a piece. Slide, please. The die stamper is on the on my left, and this incredibly heavy steel machine was attached to a motor. Obviously, early on, that would have been a belt that ran to the boiler plant, but the plunger moves up and down, and the dies that are on the right would be fixed into it. This is a manually operated machine, so you can see the green block, which the operator would move along, having different templates for the gapping of the specific impression. So we've got another slide here of various other dies that Hamilton used. I know that type, for example, could not be made quite as easily on this particular die stamper because it isn't broad enough for some of the larger stamped type, which we have seen Page and others made.
We should give a shout out here to Dan Schneider, who is an industrial archaeologist who came to the museum as part of his master's degree.
Yes, it is, right.
And he got this machine running for us, researched all the history related to it, hooked up a new motor, did inventory of the various stamps, and shared with us a wide body of knowledge, again, allowing us to continue our reputation as a working museum. So getting these machines functioning was a huge thing.
Mm-hmm. Slide, please. So these are more dies from the Hamilton collection. And just a little bit of a note regarding next week. As Bill said, Dan has gotten this machine rolling again, and while Hamilton is still making type, we also have made a very decorative border, which we'll show off at least briefly next week. So we are still working with the die stamper. It is delicate because, of course, borders need to be continuous and in some cases wrap around an image or a body of type.
What's compelling about these various dies is, as Jim notes, the recombination or the changing of combinations of these different stamps to yield different effects. So you may use 4 of these punches on one design, you may use 2 of the same and then 2 different ones on another design. And it was really a remarkable graphic design. From a graphic design standpoint, it really shows you how they were thinking of it from a modular bits standpoint. And they had to design the dies such that they wouldn't break when you would be stamping them into end grain maple. And I think it's important to say here that with end grain maple, we have our demonstration of long grain maple here. That's with the tree going this direction, right? The tree grows this way. Jim is grabbing a piece of end grain maple. And what you see here is that it's cut from the cross section of the wood. So they were cutting the wood into slabs in this way. And the important thing to say about slab type versus end grain type is you can get a really clean stamp on an end grain block of wood. And the precision that these borders allow for is really remarkable. So yeah, it was an impressive feat in terms of the amount of very simple variations of design that you could get on very hard material.
Mm-hmm. Slide, please. And it is stamped Hamilton. Okay. What we're looking at here are a couple of things. One is a pattern, and we don't have great scale there, but that is about a 20-inch tall chromatic pattern. Now you can see the Celtic face itself that we have made by Page on the one side, and the patterns that we recovered on the other side. While I cannot prove conclusively that these came from Page, what we do see is that they match his styles that in some cases Hamilton did not make. How they came to me in itself is an odd story. When I began as director in 2009, I received a call from a gentleman who said he bought a house from someone who worked at Hamilton's about 100 years ago. The attic was full of type, and if I didn't want it, it was going to the dump. So I left and got it. In fact, it wasn't type, but these chromatic patterns. And what you look at, I think we have a detail on the next slide. So let's go there, because what you can begin to see is something of the architecture of pattern making, where they would carve these, and then you would have recessed areas for the secondary color, making it a chromatic, and then those that are pronounced for the primary or the detailing color. And then you have the specimen book sample on the other side. So the this pointed, ornamented, could also be done without the points on it, and in fact, that becomes one of those variations that you will see among type makers. So it's interesting that we have these. When you really look closely at the four, you can, in essence, also see the geometry of the designer in terms of figuring out their angles.
There's another thing that's going on here with this specimen is that, as Jim points out, they could use one template to cut two different pieces of type, and so that color separation on the left would be made up of two different pieces of type registered one on top of the other. What was remarkable to us when we discovered these is that there's two different levels. You can see the way the shadows are cast on this four. There's two different levels to the pattern, and that was essentially an indicator to the pattern maker that, hey, router this part, don't router this part. But then they, for the second font, they would use the exact same template in order to cut the second piece of type. And if you've ever tried cutting chromatic type, that's hard, because you not only have to register one part of the R to the other part of the R, but you also have to be able to make the type appear, place it in exactly the same spot on the body, on the block of type. And so it's a really extremely demanding, demanding process. And so the idea that you could make a two-colored font with just a single pattern is really quite the innovation from a manufacturing standpoint, aiding precision tremendously.
Slide, please. We are back to looking at chromatic font. This Gothic paneled number 1 is shown in the William Page book in use. It is quite bright. You know, when you look at just the wood itself, I was telling Bill that it almost looks like Fred Flintstone number 1. You know, you have those rough edges of the interior, but really in use, it becomes much smoother and elegant. Slide, please. What we are looking at is an example of not just Hamilton, but William Page again. This is a detailing of a block created for the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, the Columbian Exposition. The Hamilton Company made this massive plaque about 4 by 2 feet, and what you're looking at are some of the most elegant styles that they had shown. The print itself looks a bit muddy because, well, they wouldn't let us ink it up and print it, so we actually had to stretch window film over the top to do that. but you're really truly looking at some of the peak work, and you obviously see very much the William Page influence on what Hamilton is now calling their type.
It took a little bit of arm twisting to convince Thermo Fisher, who owned the Hamilton corporate, what Hamilton became Thermo Fisher Scientific, and then it was hanging on their corporate headquarters near our old building, just a few blocks from here. And Jim and I had the bright idea one day, gee, wouldn't it be cool to print that thing? And they said, sure, as long as you don't get ink on it. So as Jim pointed out, we put a 3M window film, shrunk wrap it, and then started printing with it, which is why we call it a ghost print, because there's a little bit of imperfection to it. But it was a really great way to document a beautiful print. How many prints could you get out of a single sheet of film?
Maybe 2. I think that if you could do 2 prints an hour, you were moving along. So let's do that. Next slide, please. I want to be mindful of giving people chances to do a Q&A. So you are looking at a variety of things that are both in the specimen books, but also within our collection. So early part of the 20th century catchwords, multicolored stars, World War I soldiers. The flag there has 45 stars, so great for Oklahoma and becoming that 45th state, and I guess right before Utah. But anyway, you get to see some of those things that they would be stamping out, because beyond type, beyond borders, the printers are demanding various things. Hey, baseball is catching on. Can you get us some baseball imagery? Or things to support.
Bugling is really big, so we need a bugler.
Well, the war effort, right?
Yeah, I suppose. I
Slide,
just like
please.
the fact that bugles were becoming a thing.
All right. So I wanted to make an interesting distinction here. Hamilton began in 1880, and by 1978 they were still called Hamilton, but that was the last year. They were beginning to be bought and sold by larger entities. They made type until 1985. At that point, they moved to a smaller operation on the north side of the city called HWT, Hamilton Wood Type, where they cut type until 1993, remarkably late. Because they were not sentimental about their collection, they sold it to the Two Rivers Historical Society, but many of the records had already been long lost from the early days. And so the credit really goes out to the Two Rivers Historical Society for preserving this stuff and giving us an opportunity to begin a really wonderful museum. So, thank you, and we will be happy to try and answer any questions that anybody has.
So, thank you so much. Oh my God, that was so interesting. I have a lot of questions. First of all, a couple people asked just about the size of the specimen books. And for wood type, I just want to say they're very big, because wood type is big. Wood type specimens are big, so you need oversized books. And if you haven't looked at specimen books, if you're a printer or just anybody interested, whether it's at the Newberry or elsewhere, there's such a great window onto the history of printing, I think. They're so wonderful. But we did have a bunch of, and that William H. Page book is from the 1860s, which nobody would ever guess based on the color and the styles. They're so crazy. It looks like it's from the 1960s as opposed to 100 years earlier. But people had a lot of questions about the wood type, the type itself. So I know the 1905 specimen book said they had 1,500 specimens, but how many are extant today? How many specimens of wood type do you guys have?
We probably have about half of that number. And sadly, what we are lacking are some of the most ornamented and unusual looking ones, At the Hamilton Museum gift shop, we do have a variety of specimen books that people can buy so that they can look at things that look like type made out of tree branches or sausages. It's hard to say, but those things that were, I would say, most outlandish were discontinued because as we move toward a modernist era, we tended to get simpler. So, I'm still finding type simply because of the acquisitions that we have made over time, but variations on Gothics alone, there are probably 100 here, but of the different faces, I would say at least 200.
And somebody else had a question about whether Hamilton maintained sort of a stock of type, or was it something that they would make when people ordered it? Especially thinking about the crazier examples. Is that something they made on demand?
That's a great question, and the assumption is pretty much correct. Type, in a general way, was made on demand, and certainly if you had some of the more elegant ones, meaning more time-consuming and therefore expensive ones, those were certainly on demand. But those condensed Gothics that become all of our primary newspaper headline faces were often cut in bulk, because a set for a small printer in Two Rivers might be referred to as a 3A set, meaning that you are going to get 3 A's but only 2 B's, C's, and D's. Well, that doesn't help if you are working at the Chicago Tribune or the Sun-Times or the American. You're going to need not just an 11A set, but maybe several of them. So when they see those styles being quite popular, they would cut them ahead of time, but generally speaking, because they would have had 4 to 6 pantograph operators working at a time, they could cut your order relatively fast.
We also had a couple questions about, someone asked specifically about theater programs that these would be used on. And I will say at the Newberry, we have an excellent collection of theater programs that feature wood type. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what else wood type was used for. And I'm thinking specifically about Inquirer and the circus posters.
Well, again, that's really a good question, because when we think about that first use of a specimen book, these were people who were printing handbills and broadsides and posters and billboards. So Hamilton used to advertise the fact that they were making type from 3 picas, 36 points, all the way up to 3 feet tall on a regular basis. We now have type from the Inquirer collection that goes all the way up to about 5 feet tall. So when we think about billboard application, you do want to be able to see it from a distance away. And while in Two Rivers, the other side of town may only be about a mile away, that is not true in larger cities. But in complement to the very large type were the very large images that went along with it. So you have them cutting type, you have them cutting entire words, you have them cutting animals and show people and advertising people, right? Because as the theater became a big deal in, say, the late 1930s, you had to show huge icicles to indicate that it was the coolest place in town.
I have one of those posters. I have a Hamilton poster that says Hamilton, the coolest place in town. So somebody asked about, I'll roll this question into one of my own. Somebody asked about records of employees who worked at Hamilton. And one of the things that I have thought was really fascinating is your current wood type legacy program, where you honor volunteers and people who worked at the museum. So I was wondering if you do have a lot of records of the people who were cutting type in the early part of the century, and then how you have continued to honor people who have worked at the museum.
I'll answer the early part. because, as I mentioned earlier, Hamilton was not overly romantic about the old records. Much of that was tossed. And when they were first bought and sold in the 1970s, we don't even know what they had thrown out at that point. However, I can tell you that we have the original journals and ledgers from the later part of the 1880s, 90s, and then the first 2 to 3 decades of the 20th century. Many of those were not specific in terms of a type cutter makes this much per hour, etc. I can tell you that they were paid by the piece. So what would happen is, all right, Jill is a great type cutter. She can cut 3 to 4 letters a minute. And so she is paid by the piece. At the end of the day, the inspector comes around, decides which ones they're going to keep, and then she is paid for the good ones. Those amounts are mostly unknown until we get into the 90s, I'm afraid, or the late 80s, because those records were all tossed. I have some ideas of what the type was going for, but sadly, the archives are thin when it comes to the earlier part of that century. So we have done our best to try and pull as much knowledge out as possible. We partnered with the University of Wisconsin in Madison to digitize those archives so you can look through all of those journals and ledgers to see if there's any information that I haven't gotten to yet, because those are online. But in terms of those people that we've sort of honored because they gave or worked for Hamilton, that's up to you, Bill.
And we'll be touching on this quite a bit at next Friday's talk in terms of contemporary type cutting. And I saw some questions in the chat about, commissioning designers and that sort of thing. So we'll be talking about that at length. But yeah, we were very inspired by not only the people and these champions of type manufacturing who worked unrecognized in large part, working for Hamilton, and then to be the tremendous blessing of getting to know people like Norbert Brilski and Mardell Dubeck, Dave Arts, and others who are third generation in many cases. They were trained in over multiple generations by multiple type cutters. And when you think about the way that knowledge got passed down within a given company, it was important to us to be able to acknowledge those sort of unsung heroes and heroines of type cutting. And so that's part of what the Wood Type Legacy Project is about. But we'll be talking more about contemporary wood design next week. I also saw that somebody in the chat section asked about letter spacing. They wanted to see an example of kerned type. Here you have a beautiful Q that has been kerned so that you can scooch a serifed U up next to it, or I guess depending on what other letter you might put with the letter Q. Yeah, that's an example of kerning. And so in order to get these letters to bump up against each other, you would kern one letter and then another letter, thereby letting you scooch them closer together,
Right.
improving your letter spacing, which is very important. If any of my students are on this call, you better be careful.
I love a good kerning. We'll ask one more question. A couple of people have asked about the combination of wood type and metal type and perhaps cross-pollination with like Hamilton and ATF, but how often did they work with metal type at all, or was it just all wood type all the time?
It was all wood type all the time. I think that the metal type industry in this country was so well established that there was no way Hamilton was going to even consider that. Which brings us to another great Chicago company. Barnhart Brothers and Spindler were brokers for everything you can imagine for the printing industry. And their specimen books, which I believe you also have, are remarkable in that you can look at everything from presses, tools, metal type borders. It's really kind of amazing, but I believe the system went outside of Hamilton's knowledge as well. That idea that he was good with wood did not seem to extend too far into other areas. I think one of the things they did is also sell you blank wood, because if you did want to carve that 3 foot square clown, well, they would take care of that, but not if you wanted to cast it in metal. And I don't know that this was specifically asked, but generally speaking, wood takes over where metal leaves off. So you can only cast lead type, as it's called, so high because its body will not even support itself. You can't make foot tall lead letters, nor do you want to ship them across the country, right? And I think also conversely, wood cannot be made so small because the detailing is simply impossible once you get probably below about 36 points. Though I believe they once made 18-point wood type simply so they could say they did it.
Do you have that? Do you have 18-point wood type?
It is within the Columbian Exposition piece, yes.
I'll add to that, just to there's a refinement of that question. Robert's asking if wood type was used exclusively or if it was combined with metal type all the time, right? I mean, if you're looking at a newspaper from 1850, the headline is going to be wood and the body copy is going to be metal, hand set. After about 1865, 1870, you see this migration towards the linotype, which we won't get into now, but so they were constantly paired with each other. It was a very, very important combination. And
you had to have both, so Hamilton could make you a cabinet for your wood type and your metal type.
There you go. Thank you guys so much. This was so fascinating, and it's really so interesting to think about really the wood type industry in America really being based in Two Rivers, Wisconsin, I think, and just the fact that Hamilton is so responsible for so much of what the design aesthetic looks like in America in so much of the 20th century. And I will really look forward to next week when we get to see you printing, right? We get to see you printing next week.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm super excited. Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for being here. And I hope that we will see you next week at the same time for more Hamilton, more wood type.
We should show you where we are. We're just going to give you a tour of, this is just the staff press room here. So you can see type storage over there. We've got some show card presses here. We've got, the presses are under blankets because they get chilly. So, but yeah, so this is where we're broadcasting from today. We look forward to seeing you all next week.
And
yes, thank you. Sorry.
That's all right. Karen, I wanted to thank you and Elizabeth and Sarah as well. We appreciate the chance to talk to everybody.
Well, thank you both so much, and Jill, for this fascinating look at wood type, and I really look forward to seeing you again next week for part 2. And again, our special thanks to the Paul M. Angel Foundation for sponsoring this program, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. Thank you.